Eating disorders are technically a psychiatric or mental health diagnosis. And because of that, there are certain criteria that have to be met. But really, they all kind of have in common a preoccupation with body image or size or shape, and some behavior that kind of contributes to either eating habits that are not typical, so restricting their eating or overeating or purging, throwing up.
No, just say no. Kids are too smart for that. They want science behind that, why they shouldn't be doing it. These kids could get a hold of this and that it was such high potency. Talk to your kid. Don't sit down at the dining room table and say, now we're going to have a talk. For a safe, healthy, and drug-free community.
Watch Step Up to Save Our Children today. Hello, and welcome to Step Up to Save Our Children. In this podcast, we will talk about breaking the silence of eating disorders. For those of you who have not joined us before, this podcast is attempting to meet parents and caregivers where you are, whether at home, exercising, or waiting for your child from sports, music, or ballet. This will be your opportunity to get valuable information, to educate yourselves, to talk to your own children with honesty, truth, and authenticity. Joining us today is Dr. Rachel Goldstein. She is an expert in the field who has spent years helping young people and families navigate the challenges of diagnosis, treatment, and recovery. Together, we'll break down the myth, talk about the warning signs, and share hopeful strategies for healing. Whether you're a parent, an educator, or teen yourself, this is a conversation you won't want to miss. So welcome, Dr. Goldstein.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here today. Yeah.
Oh, you're amazing. So I'm going to share with our guest a little bit about you. Dr. Rachel Goldstein is an adolescent medicine specialist at Stanford University. She provides primary care as well as subspecialty care focused on reproductive health, eating disorders, and substance use, among other conditions. Her research focuses on expanding reproductive health care access and adolescent confidentiality within the electronic health record. So, without further ado, I want to just say thank you for being here and welcome.
Yeah. No, I'm super excited to be here and talk about the subject today. Yeah.
Well, so good because, we live in a suburb where there's a lot of some of this is going on, and I don't think people understand. So that's why I really wanted to tackle this today. So is background, what first drew you to the field of this type of medicine and eating disorders particular?
Yeah. No, I think that adolescents and sort of the field that is adolescent medicine is probably the coolest, no bias. But I think it's such an amazing opportunity to really meet young people where they are. The field of adolescent medicine is not super old, but it's been around maybe 50 years plus at this point, and really can take people who are trained as pediatricians, internal medicine, family medicine providers, and gives 3 extra years of training specifically to take care of teenagers and young adults, and really all the angsty topics, I think we like to say, that kind of come up in that time frame. And you really have this opportunity to kind of be this uniquely trusted adult. You're not their parents, obviously. As a provider, you're not the pediatrician, let's say, that they saw when they were 2. And so I think because of that, we're able to provide this really unique role to meet them where they're at. Maybe if they're not making the best decisions at the moment, but hopefully kind of work with them to get them to the other side of adulthood and adulting. And so, yeah, it's an awesome field. Highly recommend. But yeah, I think that kind of unique opportunity is what drew me to the field. And then within it, yeah, we do reproductive health, we do eating disorder care, we do mental health, substance use, kind of all the things. And so we really, I would say, are skilled at communication. And that's, whether it's to the teen themselves, to the family, that's, I think, what you mentioned earlier, kind of speaking about these hard subjects is what we can do really well in this field.
Well, I have to agree. I always thought with my own children, I watch it with my grandchildren, there's a gap between the
Oh,
pediatrician and where they go for, I guess what you would call adult medicine,
yeah.
and what the chances and the choices are that they make during those years is so powerful. I mean, to be able to actually influence them while their brains are developing is just a wonderful opportunity. So I applaud you. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So, for listeners who may not know much about eating disorders,
Mhm.
how do you define an eating disorder?
Yeah, great question. So, eating disorders are technically a psychiatric or mental health diagnosis. And because of that, there are certain criteria that have to be met. But really, they all kind of have in common a preoccupation with body image or size or shape, um, and some behavior that kind of contributes to either eating habits that are not typical, so restricting their eating or overeating or purging, throwing up. So some abnormal eating habit, kind of the thoughts part, so that body image kind of preoccupation piece, and it has to be going over for some amount of time. So you kind of need a mixture of all those things, but it ends up affecting kind of how they live their life and eat and think about their body. But again, because it's psychiatric, it has these really specific criteria that you can look up in the textbook. Different from that, what I always like to highlight is disordered eating. So I almost think of it like two sides of the same coin, right? But disordered eating may not kind of check all the boxes of the textbook definition of an eating disorder, which is really that specific kind of examples I was giving earlier, but instead are sort of eating habits that still are not great. So maybe you're skipping breakfast or skipping lunch, not full blown, like you're trying to lose weight inappropriately, but still they're habits that at the end of the day will kind of catch up with you. Or if you're not eating carbs, maybe you don't have the body image stuff that's going along with it, but still, like carbs are important. They fuel our brain. And so there's definitely a bigger population or group of people that are engaging in disordered eating, so kind of these habits that are just not great, then have kind of textbook defined eating disorders. But still, when we look at the end of the day, like how are people going through the world and making these choices, they're not great, and can
Right.
medically catch up with them too.
Sure. So, what you see with your patients, what is, I know you're in California, what
Oh,
is the most common
mm.
one that you see
Yeah,
of the disorders?
yeah, yeah. So kind of looking across the lifespan, about 10% of people in the US will have an eating disorder at some point. That's 30 million people. That's a lot of people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right. Of the ones that are, if you look at sort of prevalence or how common they are, binge eating disorder. So people who are eating sort of an objectively large amount of food in one sitting, and occurring again on some frequency. It's not just kind of a one time thing. That is the most common. It's maybe about 2% in girls, about 1-ish% in boys, across the lifetime. The next most common is bulimia. So people who are eating a large amount of food. And then what's the defining characteristic of that disorder versus binge eating is that they have a compensation. They feel like they have to kind of get rid of that food in some way. Sometimes it's purging, vomiting. Sometimes it's other things to get rid of that: laxatives, diet pills, exercise. Um, and that's again about like 1-ish% for girls, 0.5% for boys, so a little bit less common. And then anorexia nervosa, the kind of restricting eating disorder that I think many people think of when they think of eating disorders,
Hmm.
is really the least common. It's about 0.3% for both boys and girls. All of these, though, right, it's probably an underestimation, but people over the years have tried to get a sense of the prevalence. There are a couple more types of eating disorders that we definitely see as well. So atypical anorexia nervosa, none of us love the name. Really, all it means is that someone has anorexia, meaning they are restricting their eating, they have those body image thoughts, the behaviors, but instead of ending up lower weight, they may still actually be higher weight or normal weight even. And so, as you can imagine, those folks do not get picked up, often until it's been a long time, of them engaging and having these thoughts. And the estimates are anywhere between like 0.2% and maybe 5%. Again, it's probably a bigger population than we know. And then the last one I wanted to call out is ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. This is really, really severe picky eating. And this one, I will say, feels like it has been on the rise in part because in the past, maybe before, within the last 10 years or so, um, it wasn't an official category or diagnosis. It was kind of lumped in with other eating issues that we'll just kind of lump together. But it got its own name within the last 10 years or so. And I feel like now we are seeing that come up a lot more. Back in the day, it might have been, a pediatrician saying, oh, they'll grow out of it, that severe picky eating. And what we sometimes see is as they get into adolescence where puberty's happening, the demands on the body are just so high because literally your heart is growing, your brain is growing, that picky eating kind of can't be sustained on, goldfish and chicken fingers. And so,
Mhm.
they end up really struggling. Or, there's some event that kind of triggers that kid who is maybe otherwise eating well, but now really severely restricts the types of foods that they're eating. And that, again, anywhere between 0.5% and 5%. So, not small numbers. I think
No.
part of what contributes to the idea of how common these eating disorders are and kind of the perception, the severity almost is that, there are ones like anorexia that really will land people in medical care, right?
Mhm.
Because if you're not eating, if you're
Yeah.
starving your body, that will have consequences. Whereas some
Mhm.
of the others, like binge eating disorder, they're eating this large amount of foods, they may end up higher weight but they're not presenting to care or presenting medically in quite the same way. And so I
Right.
think that also kind of gets at this how common are these, yeah, versus what the numbers tell us.
And I think people in general have sort of, that are not trained in this, of course, like you, that just have a perception of
Mm,
what an eating disorder is actually very different than what the eating disorders are for the most part. So, between movies and different things that we have seen,
yeah.
we see the child or the person that is restricting what they're eating, and or like you said with the bulimia throwing it up and that type of thing,
Mhm.
but then there's always also the other one that is like so over exercising that they are, burning up every single thing they possibly are getting in. And maybe they're taking a little bit in to begin with. And then what they're eating, they're just burning it up. Do you see that?
Yeah, we definitely do. So I think to echo the comment you just made about who has an eating disorder and what is the first thing that comes into our minds when someone
Mm-hmm.
does, it is for sure the white kind of upper class, well-to-do teenage
Mm-hmm.
girl. Um, and really, I think if there's one takeaway, that listeners can have is that there's no, um, all the evidence that we have says that everyone is sort of at risk for having an eating disorder, regardless of how much money you have, what you look like, race, ethnicity,
Mm-hmm.
everything. Um, what we know is that people don't get screened in the same way, right? So that they're not going to get
Right.
picked up in the same way. So
Mm-mm.
the science says if you are um, kind of poor, if you are black or brown or minoritized in some way, LGBTQ, like you are less likely to get screened and
Right.
receive treatment, unfortunately. If you
Mm-hmm.
are in a larger body, I think the same, right? Because people are not kind of looking for that.
No.
And so a lot of work to be done on just kind of screening and asking
Mm-hmm.
people, at their well checks,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
hey, like, what do you think about your body? Any concerns about your eating? Um, versus sort of just thinking about it when we see, someone look a certain way and walk into
Mm-hmm.
the room.
Right. And I think that, that's assuming that everybody's getting a well check, which darn well they're not.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's that too that is definitely a factor. And what kinds of things are would you consider in our society as risk factors
Mm,
for a child, to start in any one of these directions?
yeah. So what we know about eating disorders is, like many conditions that are complicated, is that
Hmm.
there's multiple factors that go into who gets an eating disorder and why. So yeah, for eating disorders, it really is multifactorial in terms of why someone gets an eating disorder. The way I like to conceptualize it, that I heard once, was there's predisposing factors. So that's our genetics. We know from studies that eating disorders can run in families. There are then the sort of precipitating factors. So things that happen in life that can kind of set one off. These are things like stress, trauma, social media can kind of fall in that category. So it's the things in the world that we are sort of exposed to that if we had this vulnerability based on our genetics, that kind of tips us off. And then there are kind of, even if those first two things happen, it's not necessarily a guarantee that it will persist. And so there really are these perpetuating factors. So things that kind of, once it starts, keeps it going. And some of those are, um, you know, f- things that are related to the psychology of an eating disorder. So once people start engaging in those habits, they almost kind of get like laid in our brain. And so it makes that same behavior more likely to happen again. There's also the kind of physiologic things that happen. So when we don't eat, our GI system slows down. So we actually get full more quickly. People get constipated. And that again reinforces then eating less. And then there's the kind of social piece, right? Maybe someone was higher weight, lost weight, people are like, hey, you look great. That then reinforces them continuing these same habits that the person who made that comment may not know. Hey, this person lost weight because they are skipping breakfast, lunch, and dinner, not like, hey, they're adapting healthy lifestyles. But at the end of the day, that comment, was the comment and landed how it landed. So there's kind of those three buckets, like the genetic piece, the life factors that kind of tipped it off, and then how behaviors, both psychological, physical, kind of keep it going.
Sure. And it seems like there's, kids out there that feel, I mean, let's face it, this is a rough time for kids to begin with. I mean, and then in our culture right now, really, really difficult. So once they start down that, maybe they did have some sort of a genetic
Mhm.
predisposition. I don't know, possibly, like you said.
Yeah.
But once they start going down that, it's, I know there's a lot of myths, and I'm going to ask you about that. But it seems to me like they are constantly, um, redoing this in hopes of a different outcome. Like maybe the weight loss, of course, whatever that's their goal, I guess, to a certain extent, but inevitably they end up in a situation that they didn't really ever think could
Mhm.
happen to them.
Yeah.
So, as I said before, when I chatted with you, I have a great niece, and it was 12 years old at the time. And we'll talk about social media because I think that was a huge
Mhm.
part. But she
Mhm.
went down that rabbit hole, I will whatever, and she could not turn it around, and her parents couldn't turn it around. And she was in an inpatient facility out in Colorado, one of the few that would take somebody that young. And I it's just mind-boggling to me that that could happen. But I'm sure you see that.
Yeah. So I think sometimes what can happen, right, is like there is this setup. Someone starts engaging in the behaviors. Again, they kind of like the snowball starts going.
Mhm.
And the way we kind of think about it is almost like a Venn diagram. So you have the eating disorder, and then you have the person. And when the eating disorder is super strong, they're kind of like this overlapping one and the same.
Mhm.
And um, and at times, though, they might not be 100% overlap. Like you kind of have that middle ground, but then there's still that person, and then you have this eating disorder here. And so at the beginning, you can kind of see like, this person maybe told someone, hey, I have this, right? So that's kind of, we call it like their wise mind, right? Their own brain is saying, this is not right. I'm doing these behaviors and I kind of can't stop, but it makes me concerned, right? Um, but then, sort of as time goes on, if the eating disorder is not challenged, right? People aren't stepping in to be like, hey, no, we can't kind of keep this going. Then they really can merge. And that's what you spoke of like, it becomes really this rigidity that you kind of
Hmm.
can't crack without some big intervention,
Right.
therapy, an admission, something to kind of get the eating disorder to not just be running the show. Yeah.
Right. Well, and I think eating disorders don't always look like you mentioned earlier, the
Right.
way that we perceive them to look. So sometimes people are very slow at trying to intervene. And in her case, she had gone through the winter with heavier clothes on.
Yeah.
Come spring, and now it's time to put on a bathing suit. Her mother was, oh my gosh, so I think that's probably, and again, too, it might not be that look. It might be what you said. The person's totally normal, but the eating habits are so distorted or whatever.
Mhm.
And so you just don't know. So if you were giving advice to people that were looking to see if there's a problem, be it like, a parent, a teacher, friend of the child or whatever, what kind of things would you tell them to kind of look for?
Yeah. So some of the things that can be tip offs are kids who all of a sudden are engaging in food fads, right? So
Mm.
I'm going to cut out carbs. I'm going to cut out sweets. I'm going to become vegan. That should be a red flag.
Mhm.
At the same time, just to call it out, like this period of time, adolescence, which is really the time when the likelihood of an eating disorder coming up is the highest. So that's kind of why we see it in this age group. It's a time when people are experimenting with like, who am I? Kind of
Mhm.
individuating from their families. So, is I want to become a vegetarian and sort of check that out. Is that like an automatic, eating disorder red flag? No.
No.
Um, but, it's something to sort of pay attention to. So, I think in general, the kind of automatic or all of a sudden changes in how they're eating
Mhm.
should be a flag. Um, I think sometimes what we see is because of social media and just our general culture, even parents sometimes that we are working with are also kind of adopting some of these eating habits. And I
Yeah.
think it can be tricky because part of treatment is really saying, hey, this young person right now, even though they're super competent, straight A student, all the things, when it comes to their eating, cannot make good choices about their
Mhm.
eating. Parents, you need to kind of step in almost like they were a toddler, honestly.
Mhm. Mhm.
You are in control of their eating habits until we can kind of break that rigidity and they can kind of gain back that ability to eat and choose for themselves. Um, but sometimes I think because of our society and lots of people engaging in these eating habits, that can be also challenging. And so, one of the things we really stress is that teenagers are growing humans. I often will look at a 13-year-old girl and like, you need more food. Your plate should be bigger than your dad's. Let alone you're running cross country and all these other things. And so yeah, there's just like a lot of these myths and things about eating in our society that can sometimes reinforce how teens are eating and kind of the dynamics around that. But yes, in general, the food fads are definitely a flag. Skipping meals, it's really common, that I'll see a kid and they're like, I've never been a breakfast person. Again, it's just, we have to remind them your demands are so high. Like your body
Mhm.
cannot kind of, it does not have the luxury of skipping meals. So really, that shouldn't be a thing. Um, and then some other habits that we can see, obviously, people going to the bathroom right after meals should be a flag. Sometimes siblings are the ones who are like, hey, I heard them in the shower, or sort of plumbing problems becoming an issue should be a flag. Um, Sometimes we'll see things where people seem really invested or like all of a sudden really interested in cooking and cooking shows and baking for other people. But when you actually kind of pull back, you realize they're not eating any of the things that they're making. But so again, it's like this preoccupation with the food, um, but almost as a way because they're not eating it, like satisfies almost that dopamine or whatever
Mhm.
circuit to say like I was exposed to the food, but really again they didn't eat it. So we definitely see that sometimes. And then we'll sometimes see the eating behaviors itself. So you'll maybe be sitting down for dinner and they have a plate in front of them, but we call it micro cutting or other behaviors where they're, cutting
Mhm.
their food in teeny tiny pieces, moving around the plate. Again, if you
Mhm.
weren't kind of paying attention, it looks like they're engaging with their food, but at the end of the meal, like not much actually has made it into their bodies. And so again, it's kind of like you're a little bit of a detective and looking at, what's coming back for lunch in the lunchbox, what's happening on the dinner plate, how do their clothes fit? And sometimes it's hard to be that detective at this time when they're trying to understandably, developmentally appropriately, like
And be
separate.
private. They're trying to be private, and
Right.
yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. But that's where we tell parents, it's okay if you have that gut to like say, we
Mhm.
totally value your privacy too. And our number one job is keeping you safe and healthy. And
Right.
so this something feels off, and that's you taking them in and seeing, okay, is their weight fine? And, kind of going from there. Yeah.
Right. It seems like parents can play a very positive role, obviously, but parents can play a very negative role as well.
Mhm.
And I know from people that I have known that have had kids that, have fallen into this category, the talk about food and
Mhm.
calories and, what size you are, whatever, um, keeps coming up. And I think, what kind of message are we sending to the kids if you're, really worried they've gone up a size in a dress or they've,
Yeah.
and I think parents all want the perfect children, let's face it,
Mm.
and none of them are. So, there's always those things that go on, and I feel like between that and the TV, and social media, of course, which is constantly talking about like Ozempic and
Mhm.
Wegovy and all of these things because they want you to get your weight down or you want to get your weight down, but they're all focused on that. What kind of message is that sending to our kids? I
Yeah.
wonder.
So, I mean, yeah, our society really has this idealized sense of what
Mhm.
perfect looks like, and it
Mhm.
is thinness, that is health. And it's really unfortunate. It's interesting because there's actually a study, it's one of my favorites, to just highlight this impact of media. But basically, in Fiji in the 90s, before there was big presence of TV and kind of Western television, um, eating disorders literally just was not a thing on that island. um, and TV came. I think it was maybe a Melrose Place, is what they cite in the article.
Yeah.
And shortly after that, like all of a sudden, eating disorders, like, and that kind of body, this even notion of body image and like, what am I, kind of came up. And so again, that's an early, like pre-social media example, but we definitely know this from research. Um, and let alone in the current era, we know teens use social media, some of them like almost constantly.
Constantly.
Even though we have these laws that say you need to be 13 to have your own social media account, we know from the science that younger kids also are using it. Um, and what's different about, you know, what I mentioned earlier, right? The developmental time, like it is very normal for teens to kind of judge their appearance against their friends and kind of suss themselves out that way. What's different about social media is that you have an algorithm that's kind of like driving and reinforcing that presentation of like this is normal,
Mhm.
versus like going to school, seeing a friend group across the way. um, so yeah, that kind of persistent every moment, presentation of like this is normal, this is good, definitely does not help people who may not look that way. Um,
No.
and then, a lot of claims about, what healthy nutrition is that really is not true, or maybe applicable, right? So sometimes we talk about blinders, right? So somebody who has type 2 diabetes, yes, they need to think about their own
Mhm.
personal nutrition in a
Right.
different way than someone who doesn't. Um, but really, this overall message we try to give of like, there is no such thing as good and bad food. Like, literally, that's just not a thing um, that is inherent to the food. All food gives you nutrition. There's food, yes, you have sometimes. Other times you should have it all the time, fruits and veggies, whatever. But like that moral judgment about food, like that's us, putting it on.
Yeah.
And so, whether it's comments about that, or like you said, comments about body image, it's hard. And I would say as a mom of two kids, like it's something that I'm very conscious about. Like we don't talk about bodies, like we talk about eating for strength and fueling ourselves. But we do not make comments about, other people's bodies.
And that's so important, I think. And I think some of the pictures that are on social media that have been doctored
Mm,
and, whatever, give such a false impression of what the actual, I mean, how many times do you see a family on, and maybe it's a normal family shot, I don't mean that, but on, Facebook or something like that, and they're on vacation and they're having fun, and that's wonderful. That's what they should be doing. But, then I think some of these kids who never have that opportunity feel like they're being left out. And why are they being left out? Maybe because they're not good enough, they're not thin
yeah,
enough, or
yeah,
they're not. And social media just makes me crazy because of what it does to our children. And they can't wait to get their hands on it, number one. And we keep trying to backpedal that, wait till you're a little bit older, a little bit older. But we have a rule here on Sunday night dinner when my whole family comes is you put those phones away.
mhm,
We are not doing that. I don't want to see you on it, whatever, because I just feel like it is affecting so many of these things, particularly the eating disorders. Um, I don't know. So are you seeing any of a ripple effect? Like if somebody in a family has this, will
mm,
you see a younger one then picking up on
mhm.
it and doing it as well?
So that's interesting. I would say in terms of the ripple effect, once it comes out, right, that this young person has an eating disorder,
Mhm.
um, you know, o- often it's like that call to action, like urgency, right? So the first phase
Right.
is just like everybody being like, oh, okay, wow, I either thought this was happening or I had no idea, but that sort of initial alarm phase. And then once that settles, whether there was some medical thing that needed to be attended to, or just, okay, we need to get you into care, to therapy, then it's like the true work begins. Because, like I mentioned, it really is parents initially, if you're following kind of the gold standard treatment, is family based treatment for eating disorders for adolescents anyway. And that really is parents taking over. And so it's a lot of work.
Oh.
Recommend 5 meals a day or 3 meals and two snacks. So five
Mhm.
eating moments a day
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
parents are responsible for making those decisions, plating the food, everything. Um, and, that's just the logistics of the food, let alone dealing with the sort of comments and feelings and, behaviors that come up when parents are doing the right thing, holding the line, and the eating disorder is like, no. And so it can be really exhausting, honestly, for families.
I think it can be so destructive. If you have multiple children and you have
Yeah.
one that you're having to do what you're saying, with monitoring, what they're eating and if they're eating it, and then if it's staying
Mhm.
down, and then the scale, the almighty
Mhm.
scale that they have to keep making sure they're gaining or whatever. If you have multiple children, it's like having anybody that's um in that category. I don't mean just eating disorders, but
Yeah, if you had
substance
type 1 diabetes
misuse,
or something, yeah.
any of that, it takes the attention and the focus
Yeah,
only for that child and not for subsequent children. So
yeah.
sometimes there's animosity, sometimes there's acting out. It can really destroy a family, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think it creates this big stress, for the family, and so, when I've seen it go well is, I think parents making very intentional efforts to
Mhm.
make sure that other kids, have their time and space and
Mhm.
attention, um, and that can be hard,
Yeah.
depending on how sort of urgent, attending to the other kid is that's kind of going through it. So yeah, it can be really hard to balance all of that. And even just taking care of yourselves. That's honestly the first thing that I tell parents. It's kind of like when you're
Mhm.
on an airplane and they're like, put your mask on yourself.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
really like, you need to make sure you are eating and you are sleeping and,
Mhm.
have the energy to then, care for your child.
Exactly, because if you have nothing in the tank, you
Mhm.
can't give. And, money in the bank or however that analogy always is, that, if there's nothing in there, you can't give it to anybody. And I know that with some of the young people too, assuming, like you started to say, this has been perceived as like an upper class, kind of,
Mm,
but since it's not and it's across the board, I mean, people have to work. Parents
yeah.
have to work. They have to be able to pay, for food on the table and all that type. There's only so many hours in a day. I think it's just overwhelming, some of the things that they have to do. And in some cases, like my niece, they have to travel out to faraway places and stay there. And so I guess what I'm getting at is the earlier you can decide somebody's got an issue,
Yeah.
wow, it's so important. And that's why I wanted you to talk today so that we could at least raise not the alarm, I guess, I don't know, awareness
Mhm.
that this exists and, to keep your eyes open, because so much of what I have focused on for the last 7.5 years is substance misuse,
Mhm.
what to look for, what to this, how to get treatment, all that kind of stuff. But this is equally as important and can be as catastrophic as any of that for sure.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I was gonna
let's talk.
say
Yeah,
the
yeah.
mortality rate actually for eating disorders, it used to be the most, it used to have eating disorders used to have the highest mortality rate of any mental illness.
Oh,
It only recently was surpassed by opiate. Um,
oh
uh,
my gosh.
yeah, and so now it is second. And there is a lot of comorbid, meaning, you have maybe mood diagnoses, depression, anxiety, along with the eating disorder. So there's a good chunk of that happens. Um, and so because of that, some of the mortality, is related to medical consequences from starvation, from the malnutrition, but
Hmm.
some is suicide. I think it's almost 2/3 maybe. And so because of that coexisting, mental health conditions. And so, yeah, to your point about picking it up, what we know about what helps people recover is that
Hmm.
the things that sort of increase the chances the most are picking it up early, right? So just having
Hmm.
less time for the eating disorder to like kind of dig its nails in there.
Right.
We know that helps people. Related is like if there's less weight loss that happens for the
Hmm.
restrictive kinds of eating disorders, then if they haven't lost as much, it's easier to get back to what is a healthy weight range. And that is truly that one outcome, getting back to a healthy weight range is the thing that kind of is best prognosticates someone recovering, sets them
Hmm.
up for success in that way. Um, and so, yeah, I think picking it up early um, is key.
What do you kind of in your field say is recovery?
Mm, mm,
What's the definition of that? What does
good
that look like?
question. Yeah. So recovery for eating disorders is mainly, I'd say firstly, medically stable,
Hmm.
meaning they are back to a healthy weight range. Again, I think it's key. It's not to say it's a weight that they stay at forever because these are young
Right.
people who are growing. And sometimes the eating disorder can get fixated on like a number that I'm supposed to be and stay at. But
Hmm.
really, no, you see in the growth charts, like those lines keep growing until they're about 20. So it's staying within a healthy weight range. That's kind of thing one. Um, Having all the other bodily functions that should be happening, happen. So if they have a uterus, periods should be happening and they should be regular.
Hmm.
For guys, they should not have any signs that there's kind of hormones being suppressed. Um, and so there's other ways to look at that that are less obvious than periods. But
Right.
all the bodily functions basically happening. And then they're eating independently. So we talked about kind of in that classic treatment, that family based treatment model, parents are taking over at the beginning. And then as they're sort of moving through that treatment, the kid gets to take on more of that. So hopefully at the end, they are eating independently, um, going out with their friends, able to eat at a restaurant, and it's not like something that ruins the whole week. And then I think ideally, and this is the one that's kind of tricky, is
Hmm.
that they're, I would say in the ideal world, they have no body image thoughts. They can hear their weight number and it's fine. I would say realistically, does that happen all the time? No. And I would say if you asked probably an average woman, unfortunately, in our country, do you have thoughts about your body image? The answer would be higher than we would want it to be,
For
right?
sure.
But I think it comes down to if you do have those thoughts, do they, manifest themselves in any way? Do they affect how you eat? And so I think if we can get someone to a place where medically they're good, they ideally don't have these thoughts and are totally eating all the things, that's kind of what recovery looks like. Um, we know even once people do recover that there are definitely moments in life that can set them up for having a relapse. So anytime that there's stress or big kind of life changes, so often in our age group, right, we think of going off to college as can be a time. So even for someone who had fully recovered, um, marriage, pregnancy, job changes, like all this stuff, right, as life keeps going. And so people have to be kind of insightful about that. Know, okay, what do I need to look for that would be like the start of this coming back? And so that's a lot of work that also takes place as people are kind of moving through recovery.
So as they become adults and even into later parts, and obviously the stress and just like you said, all those life changes can really be difficult. Is there a physical part to this that can reoccur, like, that is hinged on or dependent on the fact that they had a eating disorder to begin with? You know what I mean? Like
Oh.
heart problems or
I see.
stomach issues or
Yeah.
bowel problems.
Yeah. So for the most part, with malnutrition, so again, this is mostly in the context of people who are not eating enough, right?
Mhm.
Um, there are medical consequences to that are really predictable, and unfortunately affect like the entire body. And so we see things like I mentioned earlier, GI. So your whole GI system kind of slows down.
Mhm.
All of these changes are really an effort to conserve energy. Like our bodies are super smart, and so they are trying to have the heart function, have the brain
Mhm.
function, and really kind of like a cell phone on low power mode. They are kind of shifting the resources to these essential parts of our body. So yeah, we see the GI system affected, skin, hair, everything. Um, for the kind of in general, the medical consequences of malnutrition and starvation, they really do recover with improved nutrition. And in general, there aren't things that are long term. That being said, the
Mhm.
longer things go on, the longer this medical consequences can go on. And so, yeah, at a certain point, if let's say someone struggled with an eating disorder throughout their whole adolescence, which should be the time that they're building all the bones that they will have for the rest of their life,
Sure.
they can
Mhm.
sort of come out of that period not having built those bones. And so they may have low bone density and kind of have the consequences related to that. Fertility in general, if people can get their weight back up and the gonads, the ovaries, and all the things kind of turn back on, then that should be okay. But definitely if they end up sort of like suboptimal, fertility can be affected in that way. So I would say on the optimistic side, a lot of what we see can really recover the heart, all these things. But definitely if it's sort of chronic or there's repeated times where they maybe recover and then drop and recover and drop, that can take a toll on the body eventually.
That's what I thought. I had one of my daughters had a friend that definitely fell in this category. I mean, she was bone thin, and
Mhm.
but she still is bone thin, pretty much. But she's got like 4 or 5 children. So it's amazing how that the body, like you said, is a miracle in itself. That it
Yeah.
is able to do that on a very low amount of calories, I would think. I mean, just by her body size, she could be eating a whole lot. So, yeah, it is an amazing thing, our bodies. But so now, if you had somebody come to you now,
Mm.
or we had a couple questions, that you suspected what had this, or was dealing with this, not had it, where would they go for resources?
Mm.
Would they go to their primary care first? I mean, I don't know. They're not
Yeah.
all created equal, Rachel. They're not.
Fair.
No.
Yeah. So And I think that's honestly, as an adolescent medicine specialist, right? There are not enough of us in the world to
No.
provide direct care to all the teenagers and young adults with our
Hmm.
expertise. So that's why, at least in pediatric training, it's actually for all pediatricians, they have a month of adolescent medicine during their 3-year training to hopefully absorb up all of our wisdom, and learn, and know as they move on to whatever they're going to be, pediatric cardiologist or primary care. What do I need to think about for teenagers? So that being said, I
A
think, um,
month. You said a month?
yeah,
Wow.
it's
Okay.
it's close to teenagers, or
Yeah. Yeah.
outside of
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
but dedicated
Wow.
month.
Wow. Uh-huh.
Um, but yeah, so I think pediatrician, primary care provider should be that first step. I think that's even one more reason to your point earlier of like going to well checks. I am obviously a firm believer in at least having that once a year touch point.
Hmm.
Pediatricians, we are all about growth and following that nice little curve you've got.
Hmm. Yep.
So, you know, sometimes it's weight loss that's obvious, right? And the parent even knows before they got on the scale. But other times it's actually like, hey, you should have kind of tracked up here if you were following along your nice little curve, but you
Hmm.
held flat. And, we pick up on that too, right? You're not kind
Hmm.
of following what we would expect. So what's up there? And
Hmm.
sometimes it can be, and I didn't mention this earlier, we kind of consider it under the disordered eating category, but we can have athletes that, maybe picked up a second sport or, went from JV to varsity. And so they actually are not trying to lose weight. They're happy with their body, but they just missed the memo that, yeah, you add on a second sport, you need to fuel that sport.
Hmm.
And so they're just kind of under eating for how much they're putting out there. Medically, as I said earlier, right, the body is very predictable. And so they can have that same effects, the heart affected, periods affected, if that's a thing. Um,
Hmm.
and so, that's why that kind of growth, checking in, having all those data points can be so helpful. But yeah, definitely first stop would be your primary care provider to kind of get that history and what's going on.
But as far as just a parent that is
Mm-hmm.
not quite that worried, but
Mm-hmm.
concerned a little,
Yes.
so they can go where for
Yeah.
resources? That's what I want to know.
So yeah. So there are different websites that I would say is probably like a good starting place to be like, hey, what would this even be if I think it is what I think it is?
Hmm.
So Feast, FEAST hyphen ED.org is an awesome website. It's like a for us by us of families who have loved ones who are struggling with an eating disorder or eating issues. And so they've got tons of resources on all the various types of eating disorders. And so that's a great place to go. The National Eating Disorder Association, NEDA, is another
Hmm.
great website with lots of resources and information. And then there are usually it's within sort of adolescent medicine, psychiatry at academic places around the country. So Stanford obviously has, Duke has a great website with
Hmm.
resources. But I would say those kind of institutions would also be a good starting place just to learn more. Yeah.
Well, you don't know what you don't know till you figure out you didn't
Mhm,
know it. But it's
mhm.
one of those things where you might think you know, but you really don't. And so thank God that you're here today to explain it to us. But people will forget and then they're going to want to know. And that's why I wanted to make sure that they had some places to go to actually look at some of the things. And one of the other things I want to say is you are on YouTube
Oh, yeah.
and you just have to Google your name, and you have broken it down in like 5 to 7 minute, um, wonderful videos on all the different eating disorders, and they're amazing. So I just want to make
Thank
sure that
you.
our audience knows about that because they're great, and I so appreciate it. Well, I just feel like this was so important to talk about today, and I so appreciate you being on because I just don't think that I think there's so many myths about it. Like you said earlier, like it is more girls than boys, but we don't really think about boys. I mean, we really don't. A lot of people anyway. And the football players, I have a grandson that's on JV and he plays the whole game. Now, he'll probably be moving to varsity. I don't know. But he works out every single day. I
Mm,
think maybe sometimes Sunday he doesn't, but they make them go. I mean, it's not like he wants to do it, but
yeah.
they work out, they do all this. And that's going to require a lot of fuel,
Mhm.
in order to do that. And I don't think, of course, all parents are not created equal, just like all providers aren't equal. So you don't know what the parent is doing for that child at home.
Yeah.
I know what my daughter's doing for my grandson at home and feeding him and everything like that, but everybody isn't the same. So you just want to make sure that they're getting what they need.
Yeah. And that's a good point that you called out that I wanted to echo. The last part of your comment was kind of about the teenager, no body image issues, but like the athlete who's just maybe at risk
Hmm.
of not eating
Hmm.
enough to fuel what they're doing.
Right.
And I definitely, in my practice, have the luxury of having dietitians, both within our practice, but also in the community. And I almost feel like every teenager who's doing like sort of the sport level that you're talking about,
Hmm.
sometimes I'm having these kids doing two-a-days, which I
Oh,
have
yeah,
thoughts and feelings about. But anyway,
for sure. Yeah.
deserve to see like a dietitian or something equivalent to really understand, yeah, how much
Hmm.
food do you
Hmm.
need. Um, and I mentioned it earlier about sort of this assumption that, that 13-year-old girl who's doing ballet, you know, doesn't need as much as her
Hmm.
dad when, she might need 3,500 calories a day. I think there were these like around the Olympics years ago, like what Michael Phelps eats in a day to kind of fuel. And I
Hmm.
think people saw that as it's obviously an extreme, but I think for some of our young athletes, like they're not crazy far off from that, like just truly needing more food than I think our brains sort of sometimes think. So that's kind of one thing. The second thing I wanted to highlight was just for boys in particular, there's a lot of evidence out there in the research that what they how they might present with their eating disorders can look a little bit different, right? So girls, it might be more like the thinness drive, um, how you look in your clothes. For boys, it's often more about like leanness and like muscularity, um,
Hmm.
but they're still engaging in behaviors that you would say around eating are not great, right? So they're
Right.
cut out all their carbs. They're eating like more protein in a day than like, anyone can eat really or even absorb.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, like it's not healthy, but it just might have this different flavor to it. Or in some ways, honestly, maybe comes off more acceptable, like,
Hmm.
oh yeah, they want to like get
Puff
strong.
up. Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
right. But when you like dig down a little bit deeper and understand like what are they doing to achieve that, you'd be like, all right, that doesn't sound quite right.
What a novel idea, though, to bring a dietitian into the football meetings or whatever to
Mm,
really discuss some of this. I just think that's an amazing idea. I'm going to run with it myself, but I do. I think that would be great. So, well, I can't even thank you enough for being on today. I know how busy, I don't know exactly how busy you are, but I have an idea how busy you are. Mom of two and then full-time job and on call and you name it. So I found you on YouTube and I said, this is the one. I got to see if I
mm,
can get her to talk to my audience and that we could share this because it's such good information. It really is. So, but thank you so much for being on and for sharing such powerful insights with us today. Eating
Thank you for having me.
disorders are complex, but the message is clear. There is help, there's hope, and recovery is possible. So, if for my audience, if you or someone you love is struggling, please don't wait to reach out for some support. You can find trusted resources, and I'll put those up under the description. This will launch in a couple of weeks, but I had one is the National Eating Disorder Association, but I will definitely put the other ones that you mentioned up, and I really, really appreciate it. So, thank you so much. You have a great rest of your day.
Thank
And
you.
for my audience, thank you for listening. You can see these podcasts on YouTube, social media, including Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. And you can also access them on our website, which is www.stepupanderson.org, and listen on Spotify. So please share, most importantly, subscribe and follow us so that we can reach more parents to save our children. So thank you so much, Rachel.